Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. My name is Ahmed Moor, a non-resident fellow at the Foundation. Today is August 26th, 2025, and I'm delighted to be here with Professor Marianne Hirsch. Excuse me. Marianne Hirsch is a professor emerita of comparative literature and gender studies at Columbia University and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She writes about the transmission of memories of violent histories across generations, a process she's termed post-memory. Apart from her academic work, Professor Hirsch has also co-founded the Genocide and Holocaust Studies Crisis Network. And the reason we are having this discussion today is in part around your outspokenness related to Colombia's adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's anti-Semitism definition. So we're going to get into the I.H.R.A. Hopefully, I didn't mess up the acronym, but we're going to get into the I.H.R.A. We're going to get into your career as well, and then more broadly, memory culture, what it means as a defined term, and what it means for societies that engage in its adoption or engage in its production. So, thank you, Mariana, for being here with me today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So my first question is really a simple one. What is anti-Semitism?
Oh, how much time do we have? Um, I think that the way it's being discussed in the United States and around the world today is a very simple way. And it's actually a much more complex problem and form of hatred that has long histories and many, and has really changed over time. And I think what we're discussing right now is primarily its, um, contemporary manifestations that are, I believe, being distorted and sensationalized. I think in its very simple form, and almost every definition you will read will have that, it's discrimination, prejudice against Jews as Jews. Jews as a race, as a culture, race, which is not really, we know those races are manufactured. The idea of race is manufactured. Jews as a culture and Judaism as a religion. And over time, over the many centuries, it's taken many different forms. And it can be manifested through words and certainly through actions. And anti-Semitism, I believe, led to the Holocaust and to the genocide against the Jews of Europe during the Second World War. I think the way we're discussing anti-Semitism right now certainly has those dimensions, but without the historical sweep and without acknowledging that there are many different kinds. Early Christian anti-Semitism, Jews killed Jesus Christ. In the sort of moments of industrialization, Jews control global finance and money, so many different ways of constructing Jews as the other in the many different cultures in which they have lived. I think we're seeing something quite simple today, but also quite confusing. So this simple idea that, it's animus and discrimination and prejudice against Jews as Jews has been extended to the state of Israel, and there's been a willful conflation of Jewishness with Israel, and I think that's caused a lot of damage.
Thank you. I mean, that's a perfect summary. And then if you could just highlight, I mean, so the way that I've understood or experienced the definition of anti-Semitism in the United States, in Europe, but also, frankly, as a Palestinian, is you take a historical phenomenon and a contemporary phenomenon that originated in Europe and grafted onto Sephardic communities, Middle Eastern communities. How do you contrast between that anti-Semitism that's rooted in Christian tradition? I don't know if I'm using the right language around that, but at least rooted in some version of Christianity
Mhm.
that says Jews killed Christ. And how do you accommodate that definition in that, with contemporary Middle Eastern or say mid-century Middle Eastern communities? I mean, was there that kind of anti-Semitism in the Middle East to your understanding?
Well, I mean, there's a long history in Sephardic Jewry as well. Jews were expelled from Spain, right? And were kept in ghettos in Italy. And, so, it's not only the Ashkenazi communities or, European Jewish community that suffered from that. It was, really quite global. Um, I mean, as far as I know, and I'm really not an expert in this, there was cohabitation in the Middle East between Jews and Arabs, Jews and Muslims. These cultures have, very common religious, connected religious traditions. Um, and I think that the moments of cohabitation, and especially Arab Jewish communities, were thriving in the Middle East before, really the colonization, European colonization of Palestine. Um, but of course, we have to acknowledge that Jews also left and actually had to leave um, a number of Middle Eastern countries in the early 1960s. What the causes are for that are complex, but I mean, they certainly contributed to what Israel-Palestine has become today.
Thank you. Yeah. And so I'd like to transition to your area of expertise, the Holocaust, before we get back to IHRA.
Mhm.
This is something that you know intimately. You're the child of Holocaust survivors. Can you describe the environment that gave rise to the Holocaust and just compare that to how you perceive, and now I'm thinking about your op-ed in the forward, how you perceive our political environment today in the United States?
Oh, that's quite a question because, of course, what I think we're seeing an echo of the kinds of fascism and authoritarianism that in Weimar, that sort of began in Weimar Germany and led to the rise of Hitler. We're seeing that kind of authoritarianism and the wielding of power and the othering of minorities today that I think gave rise to the Holocaust and the Second World War and the Holocaust. And I think the accent is on othering. I mean, now in the United States, it's migrants, it's, people of color, it's um, and in Germany it was Jews, but also people with disabilities. It was Roma, it was Sinti. I mean, sort of creating the other that will then provide the alibi for greater repression, state control, and control of all state institutions, which is, what we're beginning to see here today. So it's extremely troubling. And what's extremely troubling also is the way in which institutions have kind of willingly capitulated during the early Nazi period and are also doing so today. So, I was particularly interested in universities, you know, obedience in advance to the Trump administration and what happened during the early Hitler years in Germany, where universities were doing the same thing, beginning to fire Jewish faculty, signing on to edicts from above, allowing really state control of ideas and state control of how people are thinking and state control of what can be said and what can't be said, what can be taught and what can't be taught.
Yeah, and so when these comparisons were being made, a year ago, and I'm talking domestically, I felt that, on one level they were a little overbaked and they were maybe hyperbolic. Um, but that seems to be a misunderstanding on my part of how fascism progresses. That it starts in a small and incremental way, and then factors come into play, and the process attains momentum. Is that a more correct understanding of history?
Absolutely. It could be very small. I mean, we're seeing it in other parts of the world right now. We saw it in Turkey and we saw it in Hungary. And Turkish universities and institutions are pretty much, sort of where we're beginning to be right now, and Hungary as well. So this is not an unknown playbook. It's a very, very well-known playbook about how you start incrementally, you control various interests, and But I think the speed with which it's happening in the United States is kind of unprecedented. I think it took Erdogan in Turkey, many years to gain control of some of the institutions that had been independent of the government, and same with Orban. And there was push and pull, and there was a lot of resistance to it. And not that much international attention, or not enough international attention, and all of it couched in fear and danger from outside or from inside, or which is what we're seeing here. So this is a well-known fascist playbook. The problem in the United States has been, as you sort of outlined about some of your own feelings, that we don't have a memory here of the rise of fascism. In Europe, they do. And, European friends have come over and said, when before the election, people were talking about the rise of the far right. See, we don't have that language of the far right. We have MAGA, which is kind of a new thing, and it doesn't really mean anything. They said in Europe, when we hear about the rise of the far right, everybody's out on the streets and alerted about how to prevent it from rising or from gaining power. And in the United States, people were saying, if Trump wins, it's going to be fascism. People, I don't think, quite understood what that would mean in our day-to-day lives. It's too abstract a concept. We don't have that memory that's been handed down. We don't have, we certainly have histories of repression and discrimination here, but somehow the connections really hadn't been made, perhaps to the McCarthy era, but that was kind of short and very targeted to a particular group. So I think that's been one of the issues.
So, I mean, given your understanding of the Holocaust, the conditions that arose in Europe before that permitted the genocide of Jews, Sinti, Roma, what happens next? What happens institutionally and I'm not asking you to forecast, perfectly, but according to that playbook, what happens when the institutions capitulate, when the independence, when the freedoms are surrendered? Um, and then, of course, well, this is all relevant to Colombia. So, but what happens now?
Well, there's the, really pessimistic scenario, and there are more optimistic scenario. I mean, we're not there yet. People are fighting back. Um, it's, I think we still believe that there's some balances, and we still would like to wake up the Democrats and think that we might have an opposition party. I mean, we need an opposition party, and we need to make sure that we have elections. I think what happens for institutions like universities is so much is being dismantled and so much has been capitulated and sold out that it will be very, very hard to regain the core of the values that the universities have. But people are definitely fighting back. From what I saw, for example, in Turkey, that's been very hard because people were fighting back. There's still demonstrations every single day at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. People are out in their academic gowns, faculty, and they're standing there. But the university has been taken over by Erdogan loyalists, and they're now running the university. And even in private, that's a public university. Even in private universities, there's been a lot of state influence. That would change the nature of academia completely. And I think that's true for other institutions. We're seeing government institutions being dismantled right now.
Yeah, and so for me, I was, we communicated over email, and I told you I was in Berlin recently, and I went to the Gestapo Museum or the
Mm.
museum, and then soon after that, or maybe that day, I saw some news about ICE and some the way in which Trump was also deputizing his own police force in DC, and there seems to be a continuity there. But again, I don't want to overstate, and every case is independent. You mentioned the rapidity with which the institutions in the United States have capitulated to kind of a naked right-wing takeover. What explains that rapidity in your view? And I guess let me give more flesh to that question. How has the institution of the university changed in the past 30 or 40 years? Does that contribute to the way in which this takeover
Mm.
happened?
Well, let me just say first to the comparisons. I mean, I think you're right that having a private army like ICE, which, who are these agents answerable to? Have they sworn allegiance to the Constitution? Are they upholding the Constitution? It's not clear. But then also sending National Guard troops, and so I think one of the ways you stop fascism is to, hope that the military will not play along. I mean, that's a very big hope. Um, but we're not seeing that because we're having like an alternative institutions to the military, and also the way the appointments of and the firings within the military. So, I'm an anti-militarist and I'm an anti-war, and deep, deep and deep and deep. So for me to hope for the military to stand up, or to put any hopes into the military, is going quite far. But we do have, we have to have some hope that some of these institutions will be able to fight back. Which gets us to the question of the universities, and you asked about the rapidity and about how academia has changed. Well, I've been, teaching in the university. I mean, I'm officially retired, let me just say, but I, my retirement agreement, I was going to teach one course per year, and I've decided this year not to teach. But, that's been, something I've really been looking forward to, is to continuing my teaching. And I'm finding it very difficult to envision teaching right now under the present circumstances. But, I started teaching in 1974, so that's 51 years in academia. It's an amazing institution. I mean, academia is an amazing environment, certainly, especially US academia, with the variety of universities that we have, and the variety of things that you can do in it. It's not, contrary to what, has been argued recently, it's definitely not a woke or radical or liberal institution. These are tremendously conservative, traditional institutions that protect knowledge, the way knowledge is created and exchanged in certain traditional ways. And yet, in the 50 years that I've been in it, the tremendous changes have been able to occur. So the idea that you can have academic freedom to teach and say what you want to say, that you can have faculty governance or self-governance in the way that the institution runs itself, and that you can have um, open discussion of almost anything where people can make mistakes and change their minds and really change the way they think and act in the world, is an incredibly privileged space. Of course, the economic conditions of it are really stand in the way of that, because it's not an open institution like in some European countries. The financial costs are tremendous, but at its best, there's financial aid that's need-based, and these institutions can be open to students from around the world and from all over this country, with hopefully they will become more open to students who can't afford the costs. What's changed is, so tremendous positive changes. I mean, fields have been reimagined. When I came, I was part of the start of women's studies, which is now women, gender, and sexuality studies, part of the beginnings of teaching about race and teaching about, transnational questions and post-colonialism. And these are all brand new fields that have really taken a hold to change the way we look at history. And, this is really from the humanities perspective. Of course, tremendous changes in the sciences as well. But there have also been really quite troubling changes in the way universities have been run, and certainly private universities such as the ones that I've taught in. I think that what we had in the beginning is in my beginnings, is a sense of a community that makes decisions together, always beholden to a board of trustees that was there to make the final decisions. But the power of the corporatization of the university and the power of these boards has grown tremendously in the years that and the power that I've been in academia, and the power of administration. I mean, the growth of administration and the rift between faculty and administration. So, you know, we've always thought as faculty that our opinions don't count enough, and that we know a lot because we're in touch with students every day, and we know much more than trustees who are mostly not from academia. And that's been a constant struggle of us knocking at the doors and windows of the presidents and the boards saying, we need to make these changes. This is really not working, and the world is changing, and academia has to. But what's happened really since I think the 1990s and globalization and the way capitalism has evolved is that the bottom line has become more and more important, and the funding sources and the fundraising efforts of the university has in many ways overtaken its intellectual integrity. And I think that is part of the reason for the capitulation um, to the government, but also really before the Trump election, already capitulation to corporate forces that were very interested in controlling what can be done and taught in the university. So just to give you some quick examples of in relation to protest, because that's where everything has fallen apart now.
And to be
I
clear, sorry, I mean, you said it, but
Yeah,
I just want to emphasize it. We're talking Biden era
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, exactly. So this is way before Trump already. So that's why I'm saying the interests are corporate and not just political. I mean, they become political, and the effort to control everything in universities. But Biden era, but really Republican-led um, attempt to use various alibi for controlling universities. Um, I was a student during the Vietnam War era. I graduated from college in the spring of 1970. 1970 is when the US bombed Cambodia and when students were shot at Kent State University. We went on strike in early May in my university, never finished any of our courses, shut the university down, and yet were able to graduate. They gave us our degrees. We didn't finish, the last four courses. It was understood that protest and being anti-war was sort of part of the mission, one way that you are educating students to be world citizens. And the faculty, joined. Some did and others didn't. And there was a lot of division. And when I first started teaching in the mid 1970s, some of the faculty in the university where I taught said, "Oh, I'm so glad those radical students from the 60s have now graduated and are gone." But we made an impact, and we had the idea that we could stop a war. I mean, and in fact, the student anti-war movement, as the historians have shown, had an important role to play in the end of that war. It took many years, unfortunately, many more years from that moment. But it was possible to do such a thing. I was also teaching during the anti-apartheid movement. And again, at Dartmouth College, where I taught, there were shanties on the green for several months. Um,
So, I mean, if you'll allow me, and this may be an abstraction, but you're getting to it in the way that you're describing the way that things were as you experienced them throughout your career and the way that they are today. One of the rejoinders, or at least one of the popular points that people who were opposed to the student protests at Columbia specifically, but in other places who were opposed, one of the things they would say is, my child is just trying to get to class to learn mechanical engineering or biology or women's studies, whatever, the course, excuse me for, um, and their education is being disrupted by these protesters. And so it begs the question, which is, what is the role of the university in an open society? And then how do you respond to those parents who may be shelling out $80,000 a year and want to see, their child become a biomolecular engineer somewhere?
But I think that's where things have changed, as you said. I mean, there's a much more transactional, as I see it, a much more transactional um, ethos or feeling and in about what a university education does and what it's for. I mean, maybe I'm being idealistic to think that, it was sort of education for its own sake, or that education itself was important. I'm sure there are parents who were horrified by, the anti-war movements and the anti-apartheid movements, and at the at that time, but I don't think they had the backing of government and trustees as much. And Dartmouth College, where I taught, actually divested from South Africa. And there was a lot, students at that time occupied the president's office for several days, and faculty brought them pizzas. It was seen that protest and the discussions that go into building a movement is part of education. And as far as I'm concerned, students learn so much from trying to organize a movement like the student movement at Columbia, which is very flawed and fractured, and has had a lot of problems. But from all these failures, that's a tremendous education in itself. But I think when you see the kind of injustice going on, whether it's in this country or across the globe, and you expect your child to go to molecular biology and close their eyes to it, what does that say about our society? Why, don't we see protest as part of an education to be a world citizen?
Mhm.
And I think what we teach best in universities, I think, is to ask questions and to criticize and to critique and not to take things at face value.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that's my mission,
And
teaching,
that resonates.
yeah,
And it explains the university's microcosm. I mean, you've used the word corporatization several times, and that resonates strongly with what I've seen and what I think is happening. Um, and I wish we had more time, so I regret that we have to transition a little bit. But
that's okay.
IHRA, what is that? And why is it so objectionable to you and to others, notably Rashid Khalidi, who wrote an open letter in the New York, I'm sorry, in the Guardian. Both you and Professor Khalidi are written about in a recent New Yorker article, which we can link to as well, describing the issue. Why is the effort to combat anti-Semitism using that definition so objectionable? And well, is it an effort to combat anti-Semitism?
Well, it's not. But I think the IHRA is just part of a much larger, um, mendacious, hypocritical use of the fight against anti-Semitism, to influence and control universities, and to silence Palestinian voices and pro-Palestinian voices, to make it impossible to speak about the genocide that's happening in Gaza right now, um, and to view criticism of Israel, I mean, to um, articulate any criticism of Israel. Um, the that anti-Semitism narrative has been ubiquitous pretty much since October 7th happened. Um, but it's not new. At Columbia, it's at least 20 years old, 20 years earlier, or almost 25 years earlier. There was there was a film that came out, Columbia Unbecoming, about how anti-Semitic the university is. And, it was the University of Edward Said, who was called the Professor of Terror, but whom Columbia supported. Columbia supported his right to express his views. So, that's been a fight at Columbia. I think it has to do, at Columbia, with the large number of Jewish students and the large number of Palestinian and Arab and Muslim students, and the fact that it's in New York City. But I think part of the targeting of Columbia is also that it's also known as the Jewish Ivy. And I think that's very interesting, because I think what's happening right now is the effort to foment anti-Semitism rather than to fight it. But I can say more about that in a
Please
bit.
do. I mean, yeah, so we started off with my attempt to invite you to define anti-Semitism,
Yeah.
which again is expansive and very difficult to pin down. We've arrived at a place where people have claimed a definition. Claire Shipman has claimed a definition. She's instrumentalized that definition to broker an agreement, or possibly as part of a negotiation with the Trump administration, which is very interested in weaponizing the claim of anti-Semitism to control universities. So, if you were in Claire Shipman's position, and I know I'm asking you to empathize a lot, but how do you explain the administration's behavior in all of this? What is the trade-off between paying $200 million and accepting the weaponization of anti-Semitism, which I assume Shipman knows better. I have to believe people know better. But what is the explanatory force there? How do you explain any of this?
Well, it predates Chip. I mean, she's the third of the women presidents since Lee Bollinger, right? And so, it predates all of this. The mistake was from the beginning that claims of anti-Semitism were being, look, we know there's anti-Semitism. We talked about it at the beginning of this conversation. It hasn't gone away. It's being kept alive and actually growing for many different reasons. I think that in Europe, the anti-Semitism we're seeing is mainly anti-Israel, and the conflation of being Jewish and Israel's actions. And it's a conflation that serves Israel. I mean, it serves their politics. It serves Netanyahu because he wants to fold all of us into his orbit, and he wants to create this conflation so that all Jews around the world will stand with Israel and not be critical of Israel. There's very little space in the discourse right now for Jews like me who are critical of Israel and, horrified and, about the genocide that's going on and cannot look away because the anti-Semitism narrative is a way to get us to look away or to not see what we're seeing. So the mistake was that really from the beginning of conceding the rampant anti-Semitism, the fragility of Jews, and the victimization, the placing Jews as eternal victims from the Holocaust and the fear of its rampant, of its imminent return, caused in some ways by, the horrific massacres of October 7th, which have reawakened a Jewish fear that's never really gone away. But that hasn't, the people who are articulating it, many have absolutely no relationship to the Holocaust, but that has been kept alive, and that the fear is deep. I think it's in our bodies, but it can easily then be instrumentalized and fomented, actually. And so that's there. But I think that already President Shafik, who was, a very new president on October 7th, a new president with a very strong board, very strong corporate board with no academics, who were very eager to kind of take over. And I think that's what happened. They kind of took over the university. And the same happened with Katrina Armstrong and now with Claire Shipman, who is a board, co-chair of the board herself. She's a board member, she's rather than an actual president, right? I think it was in the interest of people of people controlling the board or one faction of the board to spread and to admit to rampant anti-Semitism on campus and, forming task forces, which many on anti-Semitism, already, I think in late October, early November, suspending student groups who are protesting. That's all part of what led us to where we are here. I think from the beginning, what they needed to say is, no, this is not an anti-Semitic campus. We have a lot of different forms of prejudice and hate and discrimination on our campuses. There's sexism, there's, anti-Black racism. Many students don't feel totally comfortable. We're doing what we can, and we have disciplinary procedures against hate speech. We're doing what we can to create a campus where people can openly discuss things and be as comfortable as you can. But coming to a campus is not always comfortable. You hear ideas that you might not agree with. They needed to protect the universities from the slander, really, that they conceded to immediately. And this task force, which was only for anti-Semitism, and these concessions, which are, to create a special administrator, to be a liaison to Jewish students, and the IHRA definition, and all of these things are there to protect one group of students when under the Trump administration, it's become illegal to have any special favors to any groups of students. So the contradiction, and the anti-DEI thing, right? You can't have
Mhm.
affirmative action. You can't have special programs. You can't apply for a grant on women's health because that's not a category, that's DEI. So to then single out one population like that, to cast that population as the most vulnerable and the most injured, when in fact, so many of our students and colleagues have family in Palestine and Gaza who are losing their lives right now, but that's not visible in the university's discourse at all. So the contradictions and the lies are so blatant that even without the I.H.R.A definition, it would be very difficult to teach. It is very difficult to teach in that atmosphere. The I.H.R.A definition just um, makes all of this official.
Right. It's a tool, but really there's an environment that required a tool, and this is the one that was available. So the we haven't really talked about the role of the press because I'm casting back in my memory. I'm thinking about reporting out of the New York Times, elsewhere, anti-Semitism out of Colombia, a hotbed of anti-Semitic action, etc. The student said, all Zionists should die. I believe I may be misquoting, and that was front page news in the paper of record. Um, when contrasted with other things that students say about other groups, not front page news. So, what role do you think other institutions have played? Because this isn't just about Columbia or academia. What role have other institutions played in driving this conflation, in maybe leaning into the idea of Jewish fragility as such, to the detriment of everybody?
Well, I think we've really been sold out by our institutions that have shown an incredible lack of conscience. And that is, I'm particularly interested as a scholar of memory and memory institutions, and in especially Holocaust memory institutions, who were formed. We have a sort of whole regime of human rights and the Genocide Convention that came, in the aftermath of the Holocaust that um, makes us responsible for prevention, for attention, and for um, a particular kind of prevention. And what we're
Allow
seeing
me to
is that,
interrupt you
yeah,
there so that we get to it. So I want to, you were the co-founder of the Genocide and Holocaust Studies
yeah.
Crisis Network. What is the Genocide and Holocaust Studies Crisis Network? And then what is the difference between genocide studies and Holocaust studies?
So it's the capitulation of Holocaust and genocide institutions that led a group of genocide scholars and genocide and Holocaust scholars and practitioners to come together to say, we've been betrayed by our institutions, we have to form our own institution. So just as one example, Deborah Lipstadt, who was Biden's envoy on
Anti-Semitism czar.
anti-Semitism
Yeah.
czar, right? But who is the world's expert on denial, on Holocaust denial, is one of the prime deniers of the genocide in Gaza. So when the world's expert on denial, then genocide denial denies a genocide, we have a problem, right? And we are in crisis. So there's also been, as Omer Bartov and others have written, a real division among scholars, especially of the Holocaust, but also genocide studies scholars, about how to speak out here. And many scholarly associations, the Modern Language Association, the American Historical Association, some big sort of US, but also global scholarly associations and institutions like the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Shoah Foundation at USC. These institutions have not taken a stand in relation to Gaza. They made statements about the war in Ukraine, Russian invasion of Ukraine. They have expanded, the Holocaust institutions have expanded their mission beyond the Holocaust. So there are testimonies from Rwanda that are collected by the US, by the Shoah Foundation at USC. The Holocaust Museum, it's in Washington itself, has expanded beyond the Holocaust to include other histories, other genocide, and other histories of genocide. But there's the Palestine exception, and this they will not comment on. So they're just going along doing their work as though nothing was happening, which is exactly connected to the histories and the archives that they're preserving.
Mhm.
And that's why we have founded this group, a network that in April, we announced it in April, and gone to several conferences, some of us, where we've let people know about it and let people know about it online. We wrote an op-ed in The Guardian, Genocide Scholars Say Stop the Genocide. And 700 people have joined from over 30 countries. And we've had, they've formed, their small affinity groups are beginning to form, and we have working groups. The mission really is to wake up these institutions and try to envision what it would be like to study our field while also acknowledging and trying to fight against the genocide that's occurring right in front of our eyes.
Thank you. And I mean, it's a brave work of necessary activism at a harrowing time. But if I could summarize, and please allow me to, please, correct me. Genocide studies and Holocaust studies were distinct. Holocaust studies is rooted in the idea that Holocaust is unique, whereas genocide studies is more expansive. But before the commencement of the genocide in Palestine 2 years ago, there was a greater convergence in the fields. Um, and then suddenly nothing at all. And so is that an accurate understanding of how genocide studies and Holocaust studies interact?
Well, the uniqueness of the Holocaust question is a very big one. I would say, scholars have spent their whole careers showing how, the extermination of indigenous Americans, indigenous people in the United States, or in what is now the United States, was horrible, but it wasn't the Holocaust. And, they go down the line and they show, exactly how unique it is. Um, in my view, each of these histories is absolutely unique, and yet they're connected. I mean, they are, I think the comparative genocide studies, which is one of the, a field that's actually very much alive and has chairs and curricula across different universities, implies that you can compare them. Well, they're not, I mean, if you can compare them, but they're not exactly comparable, as we talked about, in the beginning of our conversation. I prefer to use the term connective, because they are connected by structures of prejudice, structures of discrimination, structures of dehumanization, that kind of precede the actual killing that genocide entails. The idea of intent is very important in the Genocide Convention, which arose from the Holocaust. So these are not distinct fields, they're completely interconnected and interrelated fields. But the Holocaust has had an outside influence in the field of studying genocides. You know, most courses on comparative genocide will begin with the Armenian genocide, but much of the theory of this kind of crime and its effects on victims, on perpetrators, on what we used to call bystanders or implicated subjects, as Michael Rothberg calls it, has much of it has come out of the study of the Holocaust, because of the tremendous energy that this field gained, and the archives of testimonies, the individual voices that really came out of Holocaust studies that have now been used. This kind of testimony and oral history has been used across these different fields. So much of the theory and has come out of the Holocaust. Also, the idea of what a genocide is has been hyperbolically defined by the Holocaust. So if it's not if it doesn't have gas chambers, then it can't be a genocide. So in popular understanding. So these are not distinct fields, and I think the way that our network has grown, we called it Genocide and Holocaust Studies Crisis Network, putting genocide first, because in some ways minimize the outside influence of the Holocaust on this larger field. We decided to keep the term Holocaust in the title of the network, because that is still, Holocaust studies is still, still has a huge influence. And that's the field we really want to change,
Mhm.
and wake up and alert that they can't go on the way they have. And it's really a way to salvage a field because it's lost its moral fiber, but there's still so much historical and archival work to be done to understand how it happened and to understand its after effects. And also, of course, its after effects in Palestine, which are completely related, part of the field, but haven't been seen as part of the field as much as they should be.
Well, now there's this kind of meta, self-referential trove of information which is emerging, where people who engage in, who learn about denial, like Deborah Leibstadt, are engaging in denial about an ongoing genocide, and that can only enrich the field. And I'm making
Well,
a
and
bad joke.
understanding that, as the Nakba and also the ongoing Nakba has taught us, if we would fold that into Holocaust studies, which I think it has to be, and I don't think we can teach the Holocaust without teaching about what's going on in Gaza right now, or what's been going on, since 1948. If we fold all that in, we have to then understand that victims can become victimizers
Mhm.
and what victimization means and what the kind of fragilities and fears that go along with victimization. So, I mean, I think there's so much work to be done if we only shifted our view, and I think that's sort of the mission of our network, as well as waking up the institutions.
Is it fair to say then, again, just to summarize, that the crisis in the field of Holocaust studies, genocide and Holocaust studies, that the crisis is really rooted in Nakba denial and the denial of the Palestinian experience of what, survivors of the Holocaust, and maybe that's an incorrect statement, but at least in a denial of the Palestinian experience as it relates to genocide and Holocaust studies. Is that the root of the crisis?
Well, then I think there are many points of crisis. I mean, the crisis is about how the field has defined itself. So that denial is part of how the field has identified itself. But for example, the disallowing comparison is part of the crisis,
Mhm.
right?
That goes
So
back to IHRA.
comparing that goes back to IHRA, but comparison of anything Israel does to the Holocaust,
Mhm.
to the Nazis, or even other forms of comparison. So that's another point of the crisis, right? The geography of how you study the Holocaust, which is within Europe only, and not making connection to post-colonial,
Mhm.
to earlier German genocides, right? In Namibia, not, sort of not folding that in. So there are many points of crisis, I think, but I think the denial of the Nakba is certainly at, one of the important ones.
So again, I'll say it again. I regret we have so little time, but only 10 minutes left, and I want to get to a very important element of your scholarship, which is memory culture. And we've talked a little bit about denial. What is memory culture? And maybe can you relate that to denial a little bit? Because I observed some of that in Germany, and I don't want to talk too much. But
Well, tell me a little.
well, what was remarkable, yeah, I just got back from Berlin. What was remarkable to me was this lack of awareness about historical continuity. And so I came out of the Gestapo Museum one day. The next day, I was walking up to dinner with a friend, and I saw a group of Israelis, Jewish Israelis, anti-Zionist Jewish Israelis, protesting in a nice part of Berlin. And they were surrounded by, and it was maybe only about 20, 25 people. And they were surrounded by maybe 40 German police officers in riot gear. And I watched as these, the main protest organizer translated all of the signs in Hebrew to German to convince the German police officers that this was not an anti-Semitic protest. Uh, the awareness of the historical continuity, the way in which a lot of the leadership of the secret police and the SS and so on just changed uniforms and continued to serve in similar roles and maybe have an impact on the cultural DNA of those institutions in Germany today. None of that seemed to have passed through. And it comes from denial, and I think it comes from probably lots of things which I haven't yet processed. But I'm eager to learn about your understanding of memory culture and what is memory culture defined as, and what does it mean? I mean, I thought Germany was a successful example of of how memory culture could work, but I don't think that's accurate.
Um, was the protest against the war and the genocide, or was it a
It was
pro-Israel?
targeting the genocide. No, no, no. It was an
Oh, so
group of
yeah.
anti-Zionist Jewish Israelis protesting specifically. So the one of the spokespeople of the GHF, the American Israeli um, whatever the scheme they had in Gaza is a restaurateur, a famous restaurateur, Israeli restaurateur, and he was opening a new restaurant in Berlin, and so they were
Oh,
protesting his restaurant.
hmm. Yeah, I mean, look, Europe and especially Germany, I think German memory culture um, is motivated by guilt, right? And so that's, not a great way to remember. And it's about compensation. German reparation monies went directly to Israel. There's also a conflation of Jews in Israel and of the Holocaust and Holocaust the effects of the Holocaust and the Israeli state. And
Mm.
Germany has made Israel its Staatsräson, its reason for state. Protecting Israel is part of the reason for being of the German state. So one state is one of their reasons for being is to protect another state rather than just their own. I mean, it's very, very unusual and very, very exaggerated and hyperbolic. So what we're seeing, what we've been seeing, especially in Germany, but really all over Europe, is a memory culture that's trying to acknowledge crimes of the past and to create pedagogies and remembrance of those crimes, whether you were the victim or the perpetrator. But for a lot of European countries, it's perpetration that they have to actually acknowledge. I mean, it has to do with Spain, Spain and the Civil War, and unearthing graves. I mean, that's all part of memory culture. In the European Union has a lot of money available for memorialization, and we're seeing museums and memorials being built all the time. We don't have the same ethos in the United States. I mean, the Washington Mall does not have a slavery museum, right? It has the Museum of African American Culture now, but look how much earlier we had a Holocaust museum than a Museum of African American Culture or the memory of slavery. So we don't have that same kind of acknowledgement. And so, it led Susan Neiman to write a book called Learning from the Germans, where she compares the US South and Germany and saying Germany has really come to terms with its memory. The US South really has to still do that. After October 7th, she wrote an essay saying, I'd take all that back. It's not the case anymore. They did, but now they're doing it all wrong. So,
I'll
um,
have to find that. Yeah.
yeah, so the essay, I forgot where the essay was published, by maybe New York Review of Books or something like that. But the book is very interesting because that's sort of coming to the idea of coming to terms with the past and acknowledging. But I think, and in one of her pieces, I think she says something like the reason, well, maybe in this critical piece of her own position, she says it's in the interest of Germany to have had the Holocaust be unique and the greatest crime of all crimes, because then Germany was the most guilty of all guilty, and then we can isolate the Nazi period from the rest of our history. And so as take the Holocaust out of history, take the Nazi period out of history, and we don't have to see those connections and resonances, as you just said. So that kind of making that crime and not seeing, for example, that dehumanizing and discriminating against Jews is sort of what's happening now with Germany's migrants, right? Uh, Not seeing that because that was the exception.
Hmm.
So memory is not always for the good. It's often for the bad. I think we've seen memory being mobilized and instrumentalized for so many wars and so much persecution. We saw it in Serbia, right? We've seen it everywhere, certainly seeing it today. But I think Edward Said said something really quite, oh, if I hope I have that quote. Oh, okay, so he talks about the conflation in the question of Palestine, about the Holocaust and the threat, what Israel perceives as the threat from Palestinians. that he says there can be no way of satisfactorily conducting a life whose main concern is to prevent the past from recurring. For Zionism, the Palestinians have now become the equivalent of a past experience reincarnated in the form of a present threat. The result is that the Palestinians' future as a people is mortgaged to that fear, which is a disaster for them and for Jews.
Mhm.
Right? So I think that's actually what we're seeing in German memory culture, preventing, the idea that it's our responsibility to prevent. But I think in our institutions of memory, the responsibility is to prevent the genocide that's occurring right now and to get it to stop. And that responsibility that memory culture, certainly Holocaust memory culture, has not taken on. And I'm hoping that when this moment gets remembered, it will be remembered for the protests, for the resistance that people have put up, and not only for the devastation.
I'm grateful to you for that message and for your reflections, and I'm also grateful to you for your protests against the IHRA, against the settlement with the Trump administration. But I can't help but feel a sense of loss for your students, the fact that you won't be able to teach or won't be teaching this year as well. Um, Dr.
I'm teaching outside the gates. I'm, giving talks and lectures and seminars and so on. So
Good. I hope we
it's, yeah.
continue to. Well, we need reflections, well-informed reflections about how all of this is playing out, and um, so we have just 2 minutes left. I'm wondering, do you have a concluding thought that you'd like to share or a reflection, whether it's on IHRA, memory, culture, anti-Semitism, again, which is not the focus of your research as, solely, but
Um, I think we need to build alliances, and we need to. I think the narrative is changing about what's happening in Gaza right now. I think a lot, there was 80 Orthodox rabbis just signed a statement to protest against the starvation as a weapon, as it's being used as a weapon of genocide. But so we need to build alliances with those people who are changing their minds and not berate them for not being there earlier, though of course they should have been there earlier. They needed to see it. We need to fight against this shutting out of the realities that we're seeing. We need to make people see what's actually going on and act. I think writing statements is not enough. We need to work together to act. And I think this can be stopped. And I think we need to stop it. The United States can stop it. We need to work with our legislators. I think we need to do everything in our power to stop it.
I agree. Thank you again, Dr. Marianne Hirsch. It's been an enormous pleasure. I've learned a lot from you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.